The moment Julia Kendrick stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan's Crossing, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she made up her mind about cowboys before a single one of them had the chance to open his mouth. She had seen enough of them on the long road from San Antonio, rough-handed men who spit tobacco and hollered at women the way they hollered at horses, who measured a person's worth by how fast they could draw and how little they could feel. She had watched one of them, barely 20 miles back, shove a Mexican farmhand off a supply wagon simply because the man had been sitting on a crate the cowboy decided he wanted. No apology, no hesitation. Just a casual cruelty that wore the face of authority, and every other man on that road had laughed like it was the funniest thing they had witnessed all season. Julia had not laughed. She was 24 years old, and she had not laughed because she already knew exactly what kind of men walked the land out here, and she had already lost one of them. Her husband, Thomas Kendrick, had been exactly that sort, handsome in the way a thunderstorm is handsome, all spectacle and electricity, and just as likely to level everything you cared about. He had not been cruel in the obvious way. He had not raised his hand. But he had been a man who believed that tenderness was weakness, that love was a transaction, and that a woman's silence meant agreement. He had died of a fever 16 months ago in a bunkhouse somewhere near Abilene, and Julia had grieved the idea of what he could have been more than she had grieved the man himself. That was a terrible thing to know about yourself, and she carried it quietly. Now she was here in Harlan's Crossing because her aunt, Dora Ames, had written to say she needed help running the dry goods store since her hands had grown too stiff with arthritis to manage the books and the heavy shelving. Julia had nothing keeping her in San Antonio. The small house she had shared with Thomas had been rented, the landlord happy enough to take back the key. She had packed 2 trunks, her mother's silver comb, and a determination to build something clean and quiet from the wreckage of her previous life. The town itself was modest but alive. A main street of packed earth and wooden storefronts stretched under a sky that seemed twice as wide as anything San Antonio offered. There was a sheriff's office with a crooked star nailed above the door, a saloon called the Copper Kettle that already had piano music leaking through its swing doors at 10 in the morning, a blacksmith's shop throwing sparks in the corner of her vision, and the dry goods store her aunt operated, which bore a hand-painted sign reading Ames & Co., the letters faded to a comfortable warmth by years of hard sun. Dora Ames was waiting on the porch with a glass of lemonade, and the expression of someone who had been looking forward to this moment for months. She was 61 years old, sharp-eyed and small-boned, and she wrapped her arms around Julia with the particular strength of someone whose love was not complicated by expectation. "You look thin," Dora said immediately. "You look wonderful," Julia said, which was not entirely true but was the kinder offering. They settled into the rhythm of the store within a few days. Julia learned the inventory, learned which families in town bought on credit and which always paid in coin, learned that Mr. Holt the butcher preferred to be called Holt and never Mr., and that the family at the edge of town, the Garcias, were the ones to ask if you needed information about anything, because Marta Garcia knew everyone and everything within a 20-mile radius. She learned that the town was peaceful enough most of the time, though there had been trouble the previous fall with a group of cattle thieves who had moved through the county like a sickness. She learned that Harlan's Crossing was the kind of place where people minded their business until they needed to mind yours, and she found she could live with that arrangement. She was arranging bolts of calico fabric in the front window on her 9th morning in town when the bell above the shop door rang, and a man walked in who made her stop what she was doing without entirely meaning to. He was tall, not dramatically so, but enough that he had to tilt his hat back slightly when he came under the low doorframe, a gesture that seemed automatic rather than performed. He wore the clothes of a working man, canvas trousers worn soft with use, a collarless shirt the color of pine bark, boots that had seen real miles. His hat was a wide-brimmed brown Stetson with a sweat ring at the base of the crown that told you it was not decorative. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that had not seen a razor in about 3 days. His eyes, when he looked up from the list he had been consulting, were a warm and steady brown, the kind of eyes that did not look away when you met them. He was, in other words, entirely and obviously a cowboy. Julia did not stop what she was doing out of admiration. She stopped because she recognized the type and was already measuring the distance between herself and any foolishness. "Morning," he said. His voice was even, unhurried. "I have a supply order. I usually place it with Miss Dora, but I heard she's not been well." "My aunt is managing fine," Julia said, stepping down from the small stool she had been using to reach the higher shelf. "She has stiff hands, not a stiff mind. She asked me to handle the counter today." She smoothed the front of her apron. "What did you need?" He handed her the list without ceremony. It was written in a clear and careful hand, not elaborate but precise. She scanned it quickly. "Flour, salt pork, coffee, 2 spools of wire, a bottle of linseed oil, a bar of good soap, needle and thread, and a half-pound of dried apples." "Dried apples are a luxury," she observed without thinking, then immediately wished she had kept the thought to herself. But he only nodded, unoffended. "They are. I take them out on the trail when we're moving the herd north. The men get tired of nothing but jerky and cornbread. It helps to have something sweet." That was not the answer she had expected. She had expected something defensive, the way Thomas used to get when she observed anything that might be read as criticism. Instead, this man was simply explaining himself, plainly and without drama. "I see," she said. She began pulling the items from the shelves. "Who do I put this account to?" "Walden," he said. "Marcus Walden. I run the Double Bar W about 4 miles northeast of here." She wrote the name in the ledger, Marcus Walden. She did not look up. "You're Miss Dora's niece," he said. It was not a question. News traveled fast in small places. "Julia Kendrick," she said, still writing. "You've come from San Antonio." "I have. Long road." "It was." She tallied the order, gave him the total, and he paid in exact coin from a leather purse that was clearly not new. He gathered the items into a canvas sack he had brought for the purpose. She noticed that he placed the soap and the dried apples carefully on top rather than letting them get crushed by the heavier goods. He nodded his thanks, settled his hat, and walked out. Julia stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed. Then she went back to arranging the calico. She did not think about him. That was what she told herself. The second time Marcus Walden came into the store was 4 days later, a Tuesday morning, and this time he was not alone. He had a boy with him, roughly 10 years old, who walked with the slightly self-important stride of a child who has been told he is accompanying a man on important business. The boy had the same dark hair as Marcus, though his eyes were lighter, closer to hazel. "This is my nephew, Will," Marcus said by way of introduction. "He's helping me today." "I can carry things," Will announced immediately, to Julia rather than Marcus, as if it was crucial that she understand this fact. "I believe you," Julia said, and she smiled despite herself. Will looked at the jars of hard candy on the back shelf with a transparency that was almost comic. Marcus did not pretend not to notice. "We'll get the order first," he said to Will, without sternness, just steadiness. "And then, if you've been helpful and not knocked anything over, we'll see about the candy." "I have not knocked anything over yet," Will said with great dignity. "That's a fine record to maintain," Marcus agreed. Julia found herself watching the way Marcus moved through the store with the boy, not indulgent to the point of permissiveness, but not sharp with him either. When Will reached up to touch a display of glass bottles and nearly sent one tipping, Marcus's hand came out and caught it before it fell, and he simply set it back in place and went on talking about whether they needed more nails without making Will feel foolish about it. It was an easy grace, the kind that didn't call attention to itself. She tallied the order. Will carried the lighter items with enormous pride. Marcus left the same exact coin as before. At the door, he turned. "Good day, Mrs. Kendrick." "Mr. Walden," Will waved at her. She waved back. She mentioned it to Dora that evening over supper. The salt pork and cornbread Dora made the same way she had always made it, simple and exactly right. Marcus Walden, Dora said, with the particular tone of someone who has opinions they are considering whether to share. Good man, works hard. Came out here about 6 years ago from Missouri, built that ranch from nothing much at all. His sister lives in town, Eleanor Marsh, the school teacher. That boy Will is her son. He seems decent enough, Julia said carefully. Dora gave her the look. He is decent, not seems, is. There's a difference, Julia, and I think you know it. Julia looked at her plate. I know it, she said quietly. I just need to remember how to recognize it. Dora reached across the table and patted her hand, and neither of them said anything more about it. The weeks turned, and Harlan's Crossing began to feel like a place she actually lived in rather than a place she was visiting. She learned the sound of the town, the early morning hauling of water from the well, the blacksmith's rhythm that you could set a clock by, the way the cattle drives would occasionally roll through on the main road and fill the air with dust and noise, and the smell of 1,000 animals in motion. She learned that Mrs. Garcia was right about everything, that Deputy Haynes was afraid of spiders but would not admit it, and that the man who played piano at the Copper Kettle on Friday nights had once studied at a conservatory in Philadelphia before the war had rearranged his circumstances entirely. Marcus Walden came into the store roughly once a week. He was always brief and purposeful. He never loitered or made conversation for its own sake, but when he did speak, it was worth listening to. He asked after Dora by name. He knew the names of the families who were struggling and never mentioned it directly, but Julia noticed that his orders sometimes included small items she later found wrapped and left on the steps of certain houses on the edge of town. She didn't bring it up. It was the kind of thing a person did quietly or not at all. One Wednesday in early June, she was carrying a delivery crate to the back room when the base of it gave way. Old wood, dry-rotted, splitting under the weight, and glass jars of preserved peaches went sliding toward the floor. She made a sound of pure alarm and lunged, catching two, watching a third fall and shatter against the boards. Marcus Walden, who had been at the counter waiting for her to return, appeared in the doorway of the back room so fast she had barely registered the sound of his boots. "You all right?" he asked. She was on one knee among broken glass and peach syrup, holding a jar in each hand, her hair coming loose from its pin. She was not hurt. She was, however, embarrassed and frustrated and suddenly, unexpectedly, on the edge of tears, though she could not have fully explained why. Perhaps it was just the accumulated weight of many small things. "I'm fine," she said. "It's fine." He came into the room without being invited and knelt on the other side of the mess. He picked up the larger shards of glass carefully, not hurrying, not making her feel like she needed to move faster. He pulled a folded cloth from his back pocket, the kind of man who always had a folded cloth somewhere, and began cleaning up the syrup. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He kept doing it anyway. She sat back on her heels and watched him for a moment, and there was something in the sight of him, this big, weathered, entirely capable man kneeling on a floor cleaning up broken glass without any fuss, that made something in her chest ache in a way she was not prepared for. "You're going to cut yourself," she said. It came out softer than she intended. "I've not managed it yet. There's a broom," she said, "in the corner. I see it. I'll use it in a moment." He continued picking up the larger pieces, wrapped them in the cloth, and then got the broom. He swept efficiently. She set the intact jars aside and then stood and wrapped her arms around herself, watching. "Thank you," she said when he was done. "It's nothing." He leaned the broom back against the wall. She looked at him steadily for a moment, and then she said the thing she had been thinking without meaning to say it out loud. "You're not what I expected." He met her eyes. "What did you expect?" She paused. She was not going to have this conversation, she decided. She had not chosen to start it, and she was not going to continue it. But the words came out anyway because something in the steadiness of his gaze made honesty feel possible in a way she had forgotten it could be. "I expected the same thing I've always gotten," she said, Cowboys who are loud or careless or who believe that being rough is the same as being strong. He was quiet for a moment, not defensive, just thinking. Not all loud things are strong, he said finally, and not all quiet things are weak. She looked away first. That was new. She did not tell Dora about that conversation. But that night she lay awake in the small room above the store that smelled of cedar and old wood, listening to the town settle into its nighttime sounds, and she thought about a man who swept up broken glass without being asked and said things that were simple and exactly right. She told herself she was not interested. She told herself this quite firmly. She had come to Harlan's Crossing to build something stable and uncomplicated, and she was doing that. The store was doing well. Dora's hands were a little better with the warmer weather. Julia had made a friend in Marta Garcia, who came to the store every Thursday and always stayed an extra half hour to talk, which Julia had come to look forward to more than she had expected. She was building a life. She did not need a cowboy in it. Marcus seemed to understand this, or at least he did not press. He came to the store, he was courteous and brief. He occasionally said something that she found herself replaying later. But he did not pursue. He did not linger. He left room around himself, the way a man does who understands that not everything is his to take. It was Marta Garcia who said the thing that cracked something open. It was a Thursday in the middle of June, and they were sitting on the porch of the store in the early evening, the heat beginning to ease, the town settling into the pleasant, low-key sociability of supper time. Marta was 51, broad-shouldered, and had survived more than most people in this county, and talked about it with a matter-of-factness that Julia found both humbling and bracing. "Marcus Walden brought firewood to my neighbor's house last winter," Marta said, without any particular preamble. The Delgado family. The father had broken his arm and couldn't work. Marcus split and delivered enough wood to last them 2 months, and then he went back and fixed their fence. Julia was quiet. "He doesn't talk about it," Marta went on. "He just does it. My husband says Marcus is the only Anglo rancher in this county who pays his Mexican workers the same rate as his white workers. Did you know that?" "I didn't," Julia said. "Most people don't, because he doesn't make speeches about it. He just does it." Marta looked at her with great calm. "I'm not telling you what to do, Julia. I'm just telling you what I know about the man." Julia looked out at the street, where the last of the day's light was turning everything a deep amber gold. A wagon was rolling slowly past, carrying a family she recognized from Sunday services. 2 children were dangling their feet off the back. "I had a husband," Julia said. "He was not kind." "I know," Marta said, "and I'm not saying you owe any man anything or that the past doesn't count. I'm saying that sometimes we learn the wrong thing from the right lesson." Julia turned that over for a long time afterward. The summer deepened. The days grew long and hot with the particular ferocity of a Texas July, and the store was busy with people stocking up against the dry months, buying extra salt and flour and candles and ammunition for the occasional rattlesnake that wandered too close to the farmhouses. Julia threw herself into the work. She reorganized the shelving, introduced a more systematic ledger, and negotiated a slightly better price on their next shipment of coffee from the supplier in Waco, a fact that made Dora look at her with shining eyes and say, "You have your grandmother's head for business." Marcus came in on a Thursday afternoon in late July and was looking at the display of books she had set up near the front, a small initiative of her own. A dozen volumes she had ordered from a bookseller in Fort Worth, thinking that people in a town this size might appreciate having something to read. He picked up a volume of poetry, a collection of Tennyson, and turned it over with something that might have been surprise. "You're selling books," he said. "Trying to," she said. "We've sold 3 so far." "Which ones?" "A natural history guide, a copy of the Bible, though I suppose that doesn't count as a novel, and a farming almanac." He smiled at that. It was not a broad smile, more a shifting at the corners of his mouth, but it changed his whole face. She noticed that too. "How much is this one?" he asked, holding up the Tennyson. She told him. He bought it. She watched him tuck it under his arm along with his supply bag and walk out, and she stood there thinking that she had not expected him to buy poetry. She had not expected it at all. He came back 2 weeks later and told her it was good. "Which poems?" she asked before she could stop herself. He leaned on the counter slightly. "The ones that aren't about showing off," he said. "The ones that are just about someone feeling something honestly." She looked at him for a long moment. "I have another collection," she said, "if you'd like to see it." She did not know how it happened exactly. The way good things sometimes happen, without announcement or drama, simply by accumulating day after day until one day you look up and the thing is already there. Over the weeks that followed, Marcus began to stay a little longer at the store, not in a way that felt intrusive, more in the way that a conversation extends itself because neither person is quite ready to end it. He would pay for his order and she would mention the poem she had been reading, or he would say something about a problem he was working through on the ranch, and she would find she had an opinion about it, and an hour would have passed without either of them noticing. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by walking it. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had worked himself to bone and still lost the land in the drought of 1864. He had come west at 18 with 2 horses, $100, and the kind of stubborn, specific ambition that does not bother to announce itself. He had worked cattle drives for 3 years, saving everything, living on almost nothing, learning the land and the business from the inside out. He had bought his first parcel of land at 21 and built the double-bar W slowly, piece by piece, the way you build something you intend to keep. He had been engaged once to a woman in Missouri named Catherine who had decided she did not want the life he was building and had married a banker in St. Louis. He talked about it without bitterness, which Julia found remarkable. "She was right to make the choice she made," he said. "I wouldn't have been happy there either. It just took both of us a while to know it." "Do you still think about her?" Julia asked and then flushed slightly at her own directness. But he considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "I think about what I learned from her," he said. "I don't think about wanting her back." She believed him. That was the thing. She found that she consistently believed what Marcus Walden said, and that was not a feeling she was accustomed to having about men. She also learned that he had a temper. She found this out not from him, but from an incident in August, when a man named Doyle, a sometime ranch hand from the south of the county, the kind of man who seemed to be mostly composed of grievances, came into the store and was rude to her in that specific way that some men are rude to women in shops, dismissive and slightly contemptuous, treating her like a furniture piece that had been put in the wrong spot. He made a comment about her price on salt that implied she was cheating him, loudly enough that the other 2 people in the store could hear. Julia handled it with the same quiet authority she handled everything, refusing to be rattled, giving the correct prices clearly and offering to show him the invoice if he doubted her. He took his salt and left, making a sound of vague displeasure on the way out. Marcus came in 20 minutes later. He had apparently been on the street when Doyle came out because he came in with his jaw set in a way she had not seen before. "What did Doyle say to you?" he asked. "Nothing I couldn't handle," she said. "I know you can handle it." His voice was carefully even, but something under it was not. "That isn't why I'm asking," she told him. He listened. The line of his shoulders remained taut through the telling, and she could see the effort it cost him to stay where he was behind the counter from her instead of doing whatever the impulse in him wanted to do. "He shouldn't speak to you that way," he said. "No," she agreed. "He shouldn't speak to anyone that way. I'll speak to him. You don't need to fight my battles, Mr. Walden." "I know I don't," he paused. "I want to, that's different." She looked at him carefully. The anger was real, she could see it, but it was contained, held, directed. It was not aimed at her. It was not looking for something to break. He was angry on her behalf, and he was choosing not to act on it because she had told him it was handled, and he was respecting that. That was the moment, that precise moment, when something in Julia Kendrick shifted in a way that she could not unshift. She had said she did not believe a cowboy could be gentle. She had believed this with the certainty of a woman who had earned it, who had paid for it, who had seen enough of the world to think she had measured it correctly. She had said it to Marta, quietly, one evening on the porch. "I don't believe men like that know how to be gentle. Not really. Not in the way that matters." And Marta had said, "Maybe not all of them, but I think you know some things are worth finding out." And now here was Marcus Walden, a man with rough hands and a cowboy's life and a temper that was real and present, standing in her store controlling that temper because she had asked him to, because he cared more about what she needed than about what he wanted to do. She did not let herself act on it that day, but she stopped pretending she was not paying attention. In September, the Double Bar W had its annual end-of-summer gathering. Not quite a party, more a working supper for the hands and the neighboring families who had helped with the late summer mending and fencing. Dora had been invited for years and always went. This year she asked Julia to accompany her. "You don't have to stay long if you don't want to," Dora said, in the tone of someone who fully expected her to stay the whole evening. The ranch was beautiful in the September dusk. The main house was not large, but it was solid and well-made, built with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted and taken the time to get it right. There was a wide porch with a low railing, a kitchen garden that had seen real effort, a barn that was tight and orderly. The land rolled out behind it in waves of dry grass that caught the last light and turned gold and amber and something close to red. Marcus was there, of course, moving through the gathered people with the ease of someone in their own space. He greeted Dora with a warmth that was genuine and unhurried. He turned to Julia with an expression that was carefully neutral, but his eyes were not neutral at all. "I'm glad you came," he said. "My aunt didn't give me much choice," Julia said, and they both knew that was only partly true. She met a leaner Marsh, his sister, who was small and quick-eyed, and seemed to be testing Julia for something without being unfriendly about it. Will was there too, pursuing a dog around the yard with focused energy. The hands gathered around a long table under the open sky and ate well beef stew and fresh bread and corn, and pie that a woman named Mrs. Holt had brought, and coffee so strong it might have been a structural material. Julia found herself in conversation with a leaner after supper, sitting on the porch steps in the cooling dark, while the sound of a fiddle came from somewhere near the barn. "He talks about you," a leaner said, without any particular lead-up. Julia did not feign confusion. "Does he?" "Not in a mooning way," a leaner said. "Marcus is not a mooning person, but he mentions things you've said. He brought that Tennyson book out to the porch 3 nights last week." She paused. "That matters for Marcus. Books matter to him. He didn't have much schooling, he'll tell you that straight, but he's read everything he could get his hands on since he was 12 years old. Sharing something he's reading means something." Julia was quiet for a moment. The fiddle was playing a slow, simple tune. The stars were beginning to fill the sky in the abundant way they did out here, more stars than anyone who had grown up in a city could quite believe. "I am not looking to be hurt again," Julia said. It came out steady and clean, which was what she intended. "I know," a leaner said. "And I'm not telling you what to do. I just wanted you to know what you're actually looking at, because I think sometimes you see a cowboy and you're seeing someone else." That was more accurate than Julia was comfortable with, and she said so, which made a leaner smile. Marcus found her near the end of the evening. Most of the hands had drifted toward the barn where the music had grown more spirited. The night had gone fully dark and cool. He came to stand beside her at the fence where she had been looking out at the shadow shape of the land. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. Then she said, "Your sister is perceptive." "She is," he agreed. "She was like that even as a child. It was extremely inconvenient." Julia laughed. She did not laugh often, not yet, not freely, but she laughed at that, a short, genuine sound, and she felt him hear it. "Julia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. She turned slightly. "I don't want to push anything," he said. "I'm not built for rushing things, but I wanted you to know that the days I come into town are the days I look forward to most, and I think you know why." She looked at him in the dark. The fiddle was playing something low and sweet. The stars were doing something outrageous overhead. "I know why," she said. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. That was all. But something had been spoken that had not been spoken before, and they both knew it. The courtship, if that was the word, and Julia used it cautiously even in her own mind, was slow and honest and nothing like what she had known before. Marcus did not arrive with extravagant gestures or sweeping declarations. He arrived on Saturday mornings when the store was closed and asked if she would like to ride with him to see a particular stretch of land he wanted to show her, and she would say yes or no, and he would take either answer. He arrived with a book he had found at a trading post in the next county and left it on the counter with a note that said simply, "Thought you might like this." He arrived once with a problem. He was genuinely puzzled about a dispute with a neighboring rancher about water rights, and sat at her aunt's kitchen table while Julia and Dora both offered their opinions, and he listened to both opinions seriously and asked good questions. He arrived on a day in October when she was in a bad mood for no single reason. She could articulate one of those days when everything felt heavy and the weight of her own past sat on her like wet wool. And he took one look at her and did not ask what was wrong. He simply helped her move 3 heavy crates that had been delivered to the back room, stayed long enough to drink the coffee she offered, talked about nothing of particular consequence for 40 minutes, and then said goodbye. The next day she felt better, and she thought about the particular wisdom of a man who knew when to simply be present without demanding anything from it. She also, during those months, saw him angry once more. Not at her, never at her, not once, but at a situation that warranted it. A family named the Pittmans, who lived on a plot of land adjacent to the Double Bar W, had been pressured by a larger ranching operation out of Abilene to sell their land at an insulting price. The men from the Abilene outfit were not violent exactly, but they were persistent in the way that powerful money is persistent, showing up uninvited, making implications, putting pressure on a family that did not have the legal resources to push back. Marcus went to see a lawyer in the county seat at his own expense and came back with information about the Pittmans' legal standing that they had not known they had. He went with them to a meeting that required a full day's ride each way. The Abilene men backed down. Julia found out about this from Mrs. Pittman, who came into the store and told her the story while buying flour, her voice thick with gratitude. Marcus had not mentioned it. Julia let that sit with her for a few days. Then on his next Saturday morning visit, as they were riding along the creek that ran behind the eastern edge of his property, she had become a regular rider again, something she had let lapse for years, and Marcus had helped her find a horse named Clover who was patient and sensible. She said, "Mrs. Pittman told me what you did for them." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water. "It was the right thing to do," he said. "Most people who do the right thing manage to do it in a way that gets mentioned," she said. "You have a particular gift for doing it quietly." He looked at her then. The October light was making everything clear and precise, and his eyes were very steady. "I don't need a mention," he said. "I just need to be able to look at myself in the mornings." She held his gaze. "Marcus, Julia, I think," she said slowly, feeling the words before she released them, "that I have been wrong about something." He waited. "I said something once to someone I trust. I said I didn't believe a cowboy could be gentle, not truly, not in the way that matters." She paused. "I was wrong about that." He did not smile. He did not look triumphant. He just looked at her the way he always looked at her, steadily, with full attention, as if what she was saying was the most important thing in his current landscape. "You weren't wrong based on what you'd seen," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I was wrong about you." "I'm glad," he said simply. She reached out and, after the smallest hesitation, covered his hand on the pommel of his saddle with her own, just for a moment, just enough. He turned his hand over and held hers. They rode back in the companionable quiet of people who have said something true and do not need to fill the space after it. November in Harlan's Crossing was cold and clear. the sky a deep blue that felt different from summer blue, sharper, more certain of itself. The store stayed busy in the early part of the month as families made their last preparations before winter set in seriously, and Julia found the work satisfying in the deep, settled way that things are satisfying when you are exactly where you are supposed to be. She and Marcus had begun, by then, to be known in town as what they were, a fact that neither of them had announced, and that therefore spread through Harlan's crossing with the enthusiastic speed of something no one had been told to keep quiet. Marta Garcia looked at Julia over a bolt of cotton flannel and said, "I am very pleased." Dora said nothing at all but sang in the kitchen for 3 evenings running, which was more eloquent than any words. Even Deputy Haynes, who was not a romantically perceptive person, stopped Marcus on the street one morning to say, "I hear you and Miss Kendrick are keeping company," with the expression of a man delivering news of significant civic importance. Marcus came to find her that evening. It was becoming normal, him coming to the store in the evenings, sometimes staying for supper, his boots on the porch steps while Dora's lamp burned in the window and told her about it. And she laughed again, the free kind of laugh, the kind she was getting more comfortable with. "The whole town knows," she said. "They've probably known longer than we have," he said. She thought he might be right about that. The evening Marcus told her about his father was in November, a cold night when the wind was going around the eaves, and they were sitting by the parlor fire, the kind of companionship that has advanced past needing entertainment. Dora had gone to bed early. The lamp was low. Outside, Harlan's crossing was buttoned against the cold. He talked about his father quietly, without drama. A hard man, but not an unkind one, that was how he described him. A man made mostly of work and worry, who showed affection through doing rather than saying. Who had taught Marcus to farm and to ride and to fix things that were broken, and who had also taught him by example rather than intention that a man who never rests never quite gets to know himself. "He died when I was 17, Marcus said. "Before I came west. Heart gave out. He was 52. He was quiet for a moment. I think about him when I'm building something." "He would have liked the ranch. He would have been proud of you," Julia said. Marcus looked into the fire. "Maybe. He wasn't much for saying so, but I think so." "Did he ever tell you he loved you?" "Once," Marcus said. "When my mother was sick and he thought I was asleep. He said it to her and I heard it through the wall, and I thought if he means it half as much for me, that's enough." Julia was quiet for a long time. The fire popped softly. "I used to think the men who never say it are the most reliable," she said. "Because they are always there, because their actions are consistent. And then I realized that sometimes people need the words, not instead of the actions. In addition to them." He looked at her. "You needed the words." "I needed both," she said. He nodded. Slowly, with the care of a man who knows that the right words said at the right time are a kind of precision tool, he said, "I care about you, Julia, more than I've cared about anyone in a long time. And I will not be a man who only shows that in the dark and then pretends in the light." She felt the words settle into her like warmth. "I care about you too," she said. And then, because the fire was low and the wind was outside, and she had been holding something back for a long time and was tired of holding it, "I think I might be starting to love you, and that terrifies me." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with absolute seriousness. "It terrifies me too," he said. "I think that's probably right." She reached out and touched his face, just her fingertips, along his jaw, feeling the texture of a few days' beard and the warmth beneath it. And he closed his eyes for a moment the way people do when something reaches them that they did not expect, and it was the most gentle thing she had ever been part of. "I'm not going anywhere," he said when he opened his eyes. "I know," she said, and she meant it. He kissed her that night in the doorway as he was leaving, the cold air pressing around them both. It was not hesitant and it was not demanding. It was honest and careful and then more honest, and when they separated she stood in the doorway and watched him walk to his horse and felt something in her chest that was enormous and quiet at the same time, like the sky above the land out here, which is too big to be looked at all at once but is entirely real. December brought snow, which was uncommon in that part of Texas but not unheard of. A light, dry dusting that made the town look different, cleaner, its rough edges softened and its familiar shapes made strange. Julia stood on the porch of the store in the early morning and watched it and felt the strangeness of being somewhere she now recognized as home. Marcus rode in on the second day of the snow with his breath making clouds and a package wrapped in brown paper tied to his saddle. "Early," she said from the porch, surprised. "I wanted to beat the worst of it," he said. He dismounted and came up the steps and held out the package. "For Christmas. I know it's 3 weeks yet, but I found it in Waco last month and I've been sitting on it." She took it. She looked at him for a moment before she opened it, trying to guess from his face, which gave her a careful and deliberate blankness in return. Inside was a journal, a real one bound in dark leather, with heavy cream pages that felt expensive. On the first page, in his careful handwriting, he had written, "For your words, because they deserve a place." She held it in both hands and looked up at him and did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "I noticed you write things down," he said, "on the edges of the ledgers sometimes when you think no one is looking." She had written fragments of things, impressions, observations, a line from a poem she had been turning over in the margins of the shop ledger when business was slow. She had thought no one had seen. "You notice everything," she said. "I notice you," he said. "Everything you do." She closed her fingers around the journal and stepped forward and kissed him in the cold morning with snow on the porch rails and the town waking slowly behind him. And it was better than the last time, which had been better than she could have imagined. And she thought that this was how it worked when things were real. It got better, and it did not level off because there was no ceiling on it. He stayed for breakfast. Dora made eggs and fried bread and did not make a single comment, which required, Julia suspected, enormous self-discipline. Christmas in Harlan's Crossing was a communal event in the way that things tend to be in small towns, where people understand that the holidays are better shared. The church organized a supper on Christmas Eve, and families brought food to share, and the schoolroom was opened for the overflow, and Alina Marsh played the organ with considerable skill, and Will sang with a chorus of children his age with enormous concentration and slightly variable pitch. Marcus sat beside Julia in the third pew, and at some point during the second hymn, their hands found each other in the natural, unconscious way that means it has become the expected thing, the familiar thing, and she thought, This is what it is supposed to feel like." Afterward, in the cold and clear midnight of Christmas Eve, walking back to the store while the rest of the town dispersed into their own warm interiors, he stopped her in the middle of the street and looked at her with snow light on his face. "I love you," he said. No preamble, no decoration. Just the plain fact of it, offered the way he offered everything, straight and without apology. She felt it in her whole body. "I love you," she said back. And she meant it in a way she had not known she was capable of meaning it, down to whatever is deepest in a person, to whatever does not perform or calculate but simply knows. He put his arms around her, and they stood in the empty street of Harlan's Crossing, Texas, on Christmas Eve of 1878, and it was the beginning of the life she had not known she was heading toward. He asked her to marry him in February. He did not make a production of it. He was not that kind of person, and by now she knew this as well as she knew anything. He came to the store on a Tuesday afternoon, waited until a brief lull in the day's business, and put a ring on the counter between them. It was a simple ring, a band of gold with a small inset turquoise stone, the stone deep blue and perfectly smooth, the kind of thing you find in the Southwest and nowhere else. "I had it made by a silversmith in the county seat," he said. "The turquoise is from New Mexico. I thought it was the right color for you." She picked it up. She turned it in the light. The blue was exactly the color of the January sky out here, the deep certain blue she had noticed on her first morning and had been looking at ever since. "Marcus," she said, "I know it's not the sort of ring some women might want," he said. "If you'd rather have, I want this one," she said. She looked up. "Yes." He blinked, just once. Then the thing that lived behind his careful face, the thing she had been learning to read for months, showed itself fully, and it was warmth, pure and unguarded. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to marry you." He came around the counter and she slid the ring onto her own finger, and then he held her face in his big, rough, gentle hands and looked at her like she was the most extraordinary fact he had encountered in his life. Then he kissed her in the middle of the store, and the bell above the door rang at exactly that moment because Mrs. Holt chose that instant to come in for sugar, and Mrs. Holt backed out again with a noise of surprise and reappeared 30 seconds later with a broad and entirely satisfied smile. The news was, as expected, everywhere by supper. They married in April of 1879, in the church where they had sat together at Christmas, Eleanor playing the organ, while serving as an impromptu usher with a seriousness that was both touching and slightly comic. Dora sat in the front row and wept, not unhappily. She was very precise about this, and Marta Garcia brought more food than the reception required, which meant there was food left over for every family in the attending radius. Julia wore a dress she had made herself from ivory cotton lawn with tiny pearl buttons at the cuffs, and she wore her mother's silver comb, and she carried a bunch of wildflowers that Marcus had picked from the creek bank that morning, slightly mismatched and perfect. He waited for her at the front of the church with his hat in his hands and his face very open, the careful blankness entirely gone, and she walked toward him and thought, "This man spent months proving something to me." He never called it that. He never made it a campaign or a performance. He simply showed up day after day and was who he was, and let her learn the truth of him in her own time. That was its own kind of courage, the patience of someone who believes in what they are and does not need to argue for it, only to demonstrate it. She reached him. He took her hands. His were warm. "You look like the best thing I have ever seen," he said, quietly enough for only her to hear. "You're going to make me cry in front of the whole town," she said. "Is that so terrible? I'm supposed to be composed." "You can be composed afterward," he said. "Right now just look at me." She did. And she was not composed at all, but she was happy, which was better. The first year of their marriage was the best year of Julia's adult life. She moved into the double bar W. Though she and Marcus both agreed she would keep running the store with Dora, Dora's hands were better but still not equal to everything, and Julia had built something there that mattered to her. The ride to town each morning was 4 miles, and she made it happily, sometimes with Marcus when he was heading that way, sometimes alone with Clover and the early morning smell of the land around her. The ranch house she moved into was solid and quiet in the mornings, and full of good noise by the time the hands arrived for the day's work. Marcus cooked breakfast early, a thing that had startled her the first morning. She had not expected to wake to the smell of coffee and cornbread and find him already at the stove, and she had come downstairs in her wrapper to find him standing at the kitchen range with the complete comfort of someone who had always done it this way. "You cook," she said. "When I'm here in the morning," he said. "On drives I eat what's available, but when I'm home I cook breakfast. My mother taught me." He poured her coffee and set it on the table without making any particular point of it. She sat down and drank her coffee and watched him and felt the particular happiness of the ordinary. They disagreed sometimes. She would be dishonest if she said otherwise, and dishonesty was a thing she had resolved to avoid. They disagreed about money. Marcus was careful with it in a way that sometimes felt like scarcity to Julia, who had grown up with enough that she did not see every expenditure as a threat. They disagreed once, substantially, about a decision he made regarding one of the ranch hands, a young man named Pedro who had made a serious error in judgment with a piece of equipment, and Marcus had dressed him down in front of the others, and Julia had told him that night that she thought he had been harder than the situation warranted. He had not immediately agreed. He had listened, and then he had said that he thought there were situations where the whole crew needed to see a correction made, and she had said that she thought there were better ways to do it. They had discussed it for a real hour, without cruelty and without performance, both of them genuinely working toward understanding. In the end, he had said, "You're probably right about the public part of it," and the next day he had spoken to Pedro privately and made it right. That was how they disagreed, fully, honestly, and toward resolution. She watched him with his ranch hands and learned things from it. He was demanding in the way that people who respect the work are demanding. He expected things done correctly and said so when they were not. But he also paid fairly, as Marta had told her, and he helped when the work required it rather than directing from a distance, and he remembered the names of the men's families and asked after them. He taught what he knew to whoever wanted to learn it, without condescension, without the particular superiority that some men use expertise as an excuse for. He was gentle with animals in a way that she found quietly astonishing. She watched him once with a horse that had gotten its leg caught in a wire fence and had exhausted itself in panic. The animal was trembling and wild-eyed by the time she saw it, and she had expected Marcus to use force because that was often how it was done. Instead, he went to the horse slowly and spoke to it in a low and continuous voice, not words exactly, just sound, rhythm, presence. He stayed well outside the horse's reach for a long time, just standing there, letting the animal feel him as a fixed and unthreatening point in the chaos. And gradually, it took a long time, 20 minutes at least, the horse quieted. And then Marcus moved closer, inch by inch, still talking, until he could get to the wire and release it. And the whole time the horse stood still under his hands like it had decided to trust him. And Julia stood at the fence watching with her hands folded against her chest and something aching in her in the best possible way. She wrote it in her journal that night. She had filled a third of it already. In the autumn of 1879, Julia discovered she was pregnant. She told Marcus in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning before the hands arrived, before the day's noise had started, while the light was still low and cool, and the air smelled of coffee and the first breath of autumn. She had been carrying the knowledge for a week, turning it over, making sure of it. He was at the stove when she said it, and he turned around to face her with a slowness that told her the words had taken a moment to arrive. Then his face did the thing it did when something reached him that he had not anticipated. The careful surface gave way entirely, and what was underneath was an expression she had no word for except something like awe. "Julia," he said. "I know," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her with the specific gentleness of someone who is suddenly aware of what they are holding, and she felt him breathe against her hair, and then she felt him laugh, a low, warm, thoroughly undone laugh, and she laughed too, and they stood in their kitchen in the morning light and were 2 people who had not expected this much happiness and were finding they were large enough to contain it. "Are you well?" he asked, pulling back to look at her. "I'm very well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but otherwise well. Then I'll take the store deliveries on the mornings you need it," he said. "You have your own work." "I'll do both," he said. "For as long as you need." "Marcus." "Julia." She shook her head and laughed again because she knew he meant it and she knew he would do it, and that was simply the character of the man. Dora, when she heard, held Julia's face in her arthritis-stiffened hands and said, "Your mother would be so pleased." And Julia cried, which she had not done about her mother in a long time, and it was the good kind, the kind that releases something rather than adding to it. The winter of 1879 was harsh. The land went hard and the water had to be hauled, and the cattle required constant attention. And Marcus was up before dawn most days and often not back until after dark. Julia, who was into her 6th month and no longer able to ride Clover comfortably, ran the store and managed the ranch accounts and wrote in her journal and read in the evenings and knit things for the baby with varying degrees of success. She had learned to knit from Dora as a child and had not practiced since, and the results were enthusiastic if imperfect. Marcus came home exhausted but never empty. He always asked about her day. He always sat with her for an hour before he admitted he needed sleep, and in that hour they talked the way they had always talked, about everything and nothing, about what she had read, about a problem he was puzzling through with the winter pasture, about the life they were building in this place. He would put his hand on her belly as the months went on and feel the movement there, and the look on his face at those moments was something she kept in herself like a light. Their son was born in the first week of March 1880, a cold, clear night when the stars were doing their outrageous best above Harlan's Crossing, Texas. Dr. Aldridge attended, a capable man who had delivered half the children in the county. Eleanor was there, steady and practical, and Dora, who sat in the kitchen and prayed with fervent concentration. Marcus was not in the room. This was the way of things in 1880, but Julia could hear him through the wall, pacing. She could always tell his step. When it was over and the crying had started, the new, astonishing cry of the person who had just arrived, Eleanor came out to tell him, and Julia heard the sound he made, which was not a word at all, just a sound, and she would have given a good deal to see his face in that moment. He came in when they let him, and he stood by the bed and looked at his son with an expression she had never seen on him before and never forgot afterward. The baby was small and red and furious about his circumstances, which Julia felt was a reasonable response to them. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, and Julia placed the child in his arms, and he held him with the absolute careful tenderness of someone handling something precious and irreplaceable. "Hello," Marcus said to him very quietly, just that, hello. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused intensity of newborns. "What shall we call him?" Marcus asked, not looking up. "I thought Samuel," Julia said, "for my father." "If you like it." "Samuel Walden," Marcus said. He tried the weight of it. "Yes, that's right." "It is," she said. She was entirely exhausted and entirely happy, which was a combination she had not known before and which she suspected would define the next several years of her life. Samuel Walden grew with the particular speed of children in good-aired places. By 6 months, he was a determined and vigorous person who had opinions about everything, particularly about sleep, which he considered an unnecessary interruption to the business of existing. Marcus took the night shifts with a matter-of-factness that impressed every woman in a 20-mile radius who heard about it, since it was not at all a common practice. "You should sleep," Julia told him one night, finding him in the chair by the window with Samuel against his shoulder, both of them apparently watching the moonlit pasture. "I'm awake anyway," he said. "He quiets down when I'm by the window." He looked down at the small head against his collar. "I think he likes the sky." "He's 4 months old. People know things from the beginning," Marcus said serenely. "They just can't say them yet." She went back to bed, shaking her head, and she was asleep within minutes, and she was safe, which was the truest and most essential fact of her life now. She was safe, and she knew it all the way down. The years after that moved in the way good years move, not slowly, not quickly, but with a richness that makes them feel substantial in memory. The ranch grew. Marcus brought on a partner for the northern pasture, a man named Cole Dillard, who was steady and trustworthy and became a friend to them both. The dry goods store expanded, and Julia eventually hired a young woman named Rosa, Marta Garcia's daughter, to help manage it, which Rosa did with intelligence and energy that made Julia feel she had built something worth passing along. Will grew up and came to work summers at the Double Bar W, which Marcus took seriously as a teaching responsibility. The boy had his uncle's precision and his mother's quickness, and he was very good with horses. The town of Harlan's Crossing grew too, carefully and not without difficulty. A telegraph office arrived in 1881, which changed the nature of business in ways that were mostly good and occasionally unsettling. There was a new sheriff elected in 1882, a good man named Garza who was fair and thorough, and who was one of the first Mexican-American sheriffs in that part of Texas, a fact that caused some controversy, and which Marcus defended in the public meeting about it with the same quiet, unmovable conviction with which he did everything he believed was right. Julia wrote about all of it in the journals, which had become an ongoing project. She was on her 4th volume by the time Samuel was 2, and she had found that the writing was not just record-keeping but thinking, a way of understanding what she was living while she was living it. She wrote about the evening she had first said she did not believe a cowboy could be gentle, and she wrote about how she had been shown, day by day and act by act, that she was wrong. Not through argument, not through persuasion or pressure, but through the patient, consistent, unperforming fact of Marcus himself. She wrote that she thought the hardest thing a person can do is hold a belief they earned honestly and then let it be revised by new evidence, and that she was grateful for the evidence. She read that passage to Marcus one evening in the parlor, the fire going and Samuel asleep upstairs, the house settled around them in the way of houses that have been lived in fully. He listened with his usual attention. "You gave me time," she said, looking up from the journal. "You deserved time," he said. "Most men wouldn't have." He shook his head slightly. "Most men don't know what they're missing when they push." She closed the journal on her lap and looked at him across the lamplit room, this man she had married, this cowboy she had misjudged and then learned, this person who had taught her that her own capacity for love was larger than she had believed. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "When I came to Harlan's Crossing, I had decided I was finished with wanting things. I had decided the most I could reasonably expect was stability, quiet. Work I could respect." She paused. "I did not expect you." He was very still, the way he was when she was saying something he intended to remember. "And I am so glad," she said, "that I was wrong." He set down his book. He got up from his chair. He came across the room and sat beside her on the settle and put his arm around her, and she leaned into the broad, warm solidity of him, the man who was always exactly himself, always exactly there. "I love you," he said. "Every day a little more, I think, which I didn't know was possible, but apparently it is." "It is," she said. "I know because the same thing is happening to me." They sat there in the firelight for a long time, not speaking, not needing to. Outside, the Texas night was doing what it always did, enormous and star-scattered and alive with the sounds of the land. And inside the house was warm, and the child slept upstairs, and the lamp burned, and everything that had been broken in her had found, over these years, its way to something whole. In the summer of 1883, Julia learned she was expecting again. Samuel was 3. A person of enormous personality and strong opinions about horses, which he expressed at length to anyone willing to listen. The news came with the same morning kitchen clarity as before, and Marcus received it with the same barely contained wonder. "A brother for Samuel," he said. "Or a sister," she said. "Either way," he said. Their second child was a girl, born in February of 1884 during a rainstorm that made the roof sound like applause. They named her Clara Dora Walden, Clara for the ring of it, Dora for the woman who had opened a door when Julia needed one most. Dora came to see the baby when Clara was 3 days old, and she held her great niece with the ginger reverence of someone who knows what they are holding, and her eyes were bright. "Clara Dora," she said, "you shouldn't have." "Of course we should have," Julia said. "You're the reason I'm here." Dora looked at her. "You're the reason you're here," she said. "I just had a spare room and an aching back." Julia laughed. Marcus from the doorway shook his head with a smile. "That's not all you had," he said. "You had good sense, and you shared it." Dora pointed at him. "You're a good man, Marcus Walden," she said, which was Dora's highest form of compliment, delivered rarely and meant entirely. "I try," he said. "You do more than try," Julia said quietly. He met her eyes from across the room, and what moved between them in that look was 5 years of mornings and evenings and arguments and laughter and children and grief and hope, and all the particular, irreplaceable contents of a life shared without reservation. And it was more than she had ever thought she would have, and she was not afraid of it any more. Harlan's Crossing grew into the 1880s with the contained optimism of a place that knows what it is. The railroad came through the county in 1885, which brought change of the kind that arrives too fast to fully absorb more people, different people, the edges of the world coming closer. Julia watched it with the interest of someone who had made her peace with change, who had learned that the arrivals of new things do not necessarily require the departure of what is essential. The store expanded again. Rosa Garcia, Rosa Martinez now, married the previous spring with a wedding that had fed the entire county, managed the main floor while Julia managed the accounts and the buying, and they had built something genuinely good together, a business that was fair and dependable and part of the life of the town. The Double Bar W was prospering. Marcus had built it from 120 acres to nearly 400, steadily and without recklessness, and the cattle operation was sound and respected in the county. He still rose before dawn. He still cooked breakfast when he was home. He still read on the porch in the evenings and came to find Julia when she was awake late writing, and sat with her in the particular companionship of two people who have grown into each other so completely that being in the same room is itself a kind of conversation. Samuel, at 5, was deeply invested in becoming a cowboy. He said so repeatedly and with great conviction. He wore his small hat at every possible opportunity and had strong opinions about rope technique, which he had gleaned from watching the ranch hands with the focused attention of the very young. Marcus taught him the basics with the same patient exactness he brought to everything, and Julia watched the two of them in the corral on a Saturday afternoon, her husband and her son, the big man kneeling in the dust to show the small one how to hold the rope just so. And she felt something she had no adequate word for, only that it was made of gratitude and love and a profound astonishment at her own good fortune. She had said she did not believe a cowboy could be gentle. She looked at her husband's hands, rough, calloused, strong, scarred from years of fences and tools and the hard work of land folding around her son's small ones, adjusting the grip with absolute care, saying, "There, like that, you feel how that sits," and Samuel frowning with the concentration of the very serious student, and she thought, "These are the gentlest hands I have ever known. These are the hands that held my face in the cold doorway of Christmas, and held my son on the first night of his life, and held mine on every ordinary morning that has accumulated into the extraordinary fact of this life." She had been wrong. She had been wrong in a way that had turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her, finding out you are wrong, and having the goodness of the correction shown to you day by day. Clara, at a year old, had begun to walk with a determination that suggested she was going to have opinions about every room she entered for the foreseeable future. She had Julia's eyes and Marcus's mouth and Dora's unstoppable certainty, and she was, in the view of everyone who encountered her, an absolute force of nature. Dora, at 67, was slower but sharper than ever, her arthritis managed by warm weather and stubbornness, and the specific satisfaction of a woman who had watched someone she loved find what they deserved. She came to supper at the ranch on Sundays, a habit that had become one of the fixed and beloved coordinates of their family. She played cards with Samuel with a cheating fluency she made no effort to conceal, on the grounds that losing gracefully was an important skill for children to develop. On a Sunday evening in the early summer of 1885, when the porch was warm and Clara was asleep and Samuel was building something complicated with sticks in the yard, Marcus came to stand beside Julia where she was leaning on the porch railing watching the last of the light leave the sky. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am very happy," she said, "and that it doesn't frighten me any more." He was quiet for a moment. "When did it stop?" "Slowly," she said, "and then all at once." She smiled. "The way most things happen." He stood beside her, their shoulders touching, watching the sky go from amber to rose to the first tentative blue of evening. Samuel looked up from his project and waved at them with the casual confidence of a child who has always known he was watched over. "We did all right," Marcus said. "We did more than all right," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the porch held them both, and the land spread out before them in the long evening light of Texas, and the stars, when they came in the same outrageous abundance they always did, more than could be counted, more than could be comprehended, only felt. She had come to Harlan's crossing with 2 trunks and her mother's silver comb, and a certainty that she had already learned everything the world had to teach her about men and gentleness and the possibility of love. She had been so certain. She had built that certainty out of real things, real pain, real loss, real observation, and she had believed it in the way you believe something that has cost you. And then a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat and an exact and careful hand had walked into her aunt's store and looked at her steadily and offered no argument and no performance, only himself, consistently and without agenda, day after day, until the belief she had built so carefully was quietly and permanently undone. Not by force, not by persuasion, by the patient truth of who he was. She had said she did not believe a cowboy could be gentle. And he had spent every day proving her wrong, not because she had challenged him, but because it was simply what he was. The gentleness had always been there, in the swept floor and the steadied bottle and the held horse and the sleeping child and the cold air kiss and the turquoise ring and the journal full of cream pages and all the 1,000 ordinary days that were not ordinary at all, but were, in fact, everything. Julia Walden, who had arrived as Julia Kendrick with her heart armored and her expectations low, stood on the porch of her home in the last light of a summer evening in 1885 with her husband's arm around her and her children nearby and the whole wide Texas sky above her, and she thought, I was wrong. I was gloriously, life-changingly, permanently wrong. And there was no better thing in the world than that. She turned her head and kissed Marcus on the jaw, the way you kiss someone when you are not making a declaration but simply confirming a fact. He turned and kissed her back properly, and Samuel made a sound of theatrical revulsion from the yard, and Clara did not wake, and Dora, inside at the kitchen table, almost certainly smiled to herself. The land was still. The stars were arriving. Everything was exactly right. And in her journal that night, after the children were asleep and Marcus was reading and the lamp burned low between them, Julia wrote, I thought I knew what was possible. I had no idea. And I am so glad, so entirely, abundantly glad that someone showed me. She closed the journal and looked up, and Marcus was already looking at her over the top of his book, the way he so often was, steady and warm and entirely present, and she thought, This is it. This is the whole thing. The house held its quiet. The ranch held its peace. Outside, the horses moved in the dark pasture, and the creek ran its patient course, and the stars above Harlan's Crossing, Texas, burned in their fixed and ancient places. And inside, by the light of a single lamp, two people who had found each other against all reasonable expectations sat together in the fullness of a life they had built carefully and truthfully and with great love. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.